Hi, I'm McParland, and I'm going to go through some of the basics of painting mounts with acrylic paints, and I'm also going to go a little bit more into detail with some tips and some of the techniques that I use while I'm painting mounts. First, I want to talk a little bit about aesthetics. You'll find that different institutions have different aesthetics for how they want their mounts to look on display. Some will leave the mounts on painted metal, some will like them solid black, some institutions will just tone the mounts so that they look better with the objects, and others like to make them disappear as much as possible. And even within institutions, you'll find differing opinions among designers, curators, and even the mount makers themselves. We at the MFA generally like to disguise our mounts so that they're not distracting to the eye. The degree to which we do this varies from object to object. This is a ceramic tray. The mount for it was made by our very modest moderator, Brett Angel, who is not presenting today, so I wanted to give him a little shout out as my colleague and very talented artist and mount maker. This here is the reverse of that same tray. The curator decided that she wanted to show the back of this, which is highly ornate, and Brett didn't want the big bar of the mount going straight through the image on the back, so he went ahead and painted it to match. Our museum has a massive array of art and objects made from all different types of materials, so we employ a variety of mount painting techniques to achieve different results to get them to blend in with the objects they support. At the MFA, we use a sandblaster to prepare our mounts for painting. The sandblaster is an easy way and fast way to clean the metal and has the added benefit of giving some tooth to the surface, which provides better adhesion for the paint. This is a slide showing on the left a non-sandblasted metal, and on the right sandblasted metal. You can see that not only is it clean, but it has a nice little tooth to it that makes for good adhesion between the primer and the paint and the metal. One of the drawbacks of the blaster is that it can deform really small or fragile mounts, so it's best to use a hand file for that, but that's a lot more labor intensive. So another way that you can clean your metal before painting is to use a pickle. And the pickle is an acid solution, which we used here for many years, but it's pretty toxic, and so it's not that nice to work with. And we were fortunate enough to invest in a sandblaster. After cleaning our mounts, we prime them with the acrylic primer. In this image, you will also see on the right-hand side 2 cans of the top coat that we use to seal and protect the paint on our mounts. This comes in a clear gloss and clear matte finish. The primer comes in several colors, and we use 4 of them: black, white, gray, and a reddish brown. I will select a primer based on what the mount painting will be, and sometimes that's quite obvious, but I find that there are some different effects that can be created using the different bases. And the slide here shows 4 samples of the different primer colors that we use, and I took the same sort of terracotta color and white and did a thin swatch on each one so that you could see the difference between how the paints look on the different primer colors. On this slide, I did sample with black primer and a contrasting color on the top. It was kind of that same terracotta color, but I applied it quite thinly on the right so you can do layers and you can get some of that black coming through. In the middle, I did some of the same thin and layered painting, and then added some lines on the top with a fan brush to give sort of a wood technique. It's a pretty bad example, but you get the idea. And then on the left hand side, I took a tool and I actually scratched like grains and design into the paint surface so that you could see the black coming through. And it's a little bit more of an exaggerated example than I would probably use, but I wanted you to be able to see what I was doing. So metal objects, particularly precious metals, I typically use a white or a gray primer. The silver ewer on the left-hand side is tarnished, and it's not really a bright silver. The metal acrylic colors that we use are transparent, and if you try to opacify them with whites or other paints, they tend to lose their sort of sparkle or their glitter. And the gray primer can be pretty helpful instead of the white, because when you use the white, you often have to do several coats of paint before you get what's like a solid looking surface. Black can also be good under tarnished and worn metals like the one on the right. Here I would probably thinly apply brass paint over the black, or paint the brass and then sand some of it away to reveal the black underneath and get that nice worn effect. So you can experiment with different primers and colors and paints and see what they can do and how best to achieve your desired effects. We paint our mounts using acrylic paints and mediums, and we primarily use Golden brand. Obviously, there are many brands available, but we like the Golden products for several reasons. All the ones that we use have been Audi tested and are conservation approved for use with mounts. In fact, our conservators use them when in painting and toning on their work. Golden has also worked with conservators to create a line of paint colors that are very useful in conservation, and since we work with the same objects, we obviously benefit from that color palette as well. And just an aside, anyone who's not familiar with the Audi test, it's a basic and commonly used test that examines materials for their potential to cause corrosion or harm to sensitive materials when they're in close contact or contained together in an environment like a display case or a storage environment. Golden has a lot of different products, paints and mediums. They also make some for airbrushing, which is not something we'll be discussing today, but is another method that can be used for painting mounts, particularly when painting larger scale mounts or groups of mounts of similar objects. In addition to paint, it's a good idea to have a really wide variety of brushes and tools. You can see in this image I have all different shapes and sizes of brushes, fan brushes. Get that funky little bent one there that I've never actually used, but I think is hilarious. It's called the tight spot. And different cheap brushes and stencil brushes and acid brushes, and I even cut brushes, and I have skewers and swabs and sandpaper and all kinds of things so I can play around with and use them to get different effects on my mounts. In addition to your brushes and things, you're going to want palettes to mix paint colors, and I highly recommend using little jars to store your paints. I will spend some time mixing colors just right, and I don't want them to dry out. If I need to go back into it, I don't want to have to remake the color again, so having little jars to save some of your excess paint can be really helpful. And lastly, this is probably one of my favorite tools in the whole shop, and it's certainly not required for painting mounts, but I think it's awesome, and it's a tube squeezer, and it's very economical, and not to mention like really satisfying and fun to use. In my opinion, the most important aspect of painting mounts is color matching. So if your goal is to hide your mount, even if you don't do any detail painting or texture, the better your mount color matches the object, the less distracting it's going to be. So any of you who have an art background, you probably have some awareness of basic color and paint mixing. If you don't, a tool that can be very helpful is a book on painting and color mixing, or a color wheel. Even if you do know about color mixing, a color wheel can be really useful. It can give you indications of what colors are going to do when you add white, gray, and black to them, which is tint, tone, and shade. It helps you predict adding different colors to the color that you're working with, what it's going to do, changing their values, and that sort of a thing. So I really like the color wheel. I think it can be pretty useful even if you have a lot of experience mixing colors. It also describes, some of the general rules of paint, color, and mixing that are worth familiarizing yourself with, such as, complementary colors, and if you're mixing colors, when you apply its complementary color, you can tone it down that way. Again, tone, hue, and shade, also saturation, warm versus cool colors, and also using neutral grays. It's a good idea to get familiar with your materials. For example, varying degrees of opacity in paint colors, and they have different finishes as well. So, for example, in this slide on the left, I have painted some swatches of turquoise, and below that is a phthalo turquoise, and the regular turquoise is a lot more opaque than the phthalo. On the upper right, I painted two whites, and the top is a titanium white, and the bottom is a zinc white. The zinc white tends to be a lot more transparent or translucent, so that can be helpful. And in the bottom on the right is two black swatches, although the slide does not show them very well. We typically have two blacks in our palette, and we use a carbon black and a bone black. And I find the bone black to be just slightly more muted and more matte, so I will choose that over the carbon black for certain applications. Knowing the characteristics of your paints and your materials can help you decide what to use when you're mixing and what they will do to color. There's another thing to note is that acrylics tend to dry slightly differently than they look when they're wet. More often than not, I would say that they tend to dry a little bit darker than they appear when they're wet, but I have found for certain colors the opposite to be true as well. But just being aware of that can be a useful tool as well. I paint in layers. Painting in layers, in my experience, has given me some of the best effects. It can be time consuming, especially if you want layers to dry in between applications. It takes patience and certainly a little bit of strategy as well. I often will work on a couple mounts at the same time, so that way I can apply a coat or a layer to each one. And by the time I finish going through each of them, the first one might be dry enough to go back and apply the next layer. The main reason, though, that I work in layers is that objects are rarely one solid flat color, and the best way to reproduce the look of many layers of an object is to paint each one of them. So here is an example of what I mean. On this ceramic, you can see the clay body underneath the glaze layer. There are cracks and speckles and inclusions in the glaze. There's variations in the density of the white of the glaze, and then there's the color decorative layer on the top. So I would go ahead and I would paint each of these. On the right hand side of the slide, you see an image of the mount that I made for this. I have primed it white, and I have begun by painting the color that I would use for the clay body, and then I'll paint the subsequent layers on top of that. Wood is one of the materials that I find the most difficult to work with. It has so much variation and different finishes. It has grains and undulations of color, and for me, it's particularly challenging to replicate in paint. Wood can be pretty flat and opaque, like in this object here, but highly polished wood and veneers are far from that. For example, this violin mount, this was the first time I tried a new technique, and I'm still experimenting with it and perfecting it, but I think it works pretty well. Instead of using straight paint, I took the lighter color of the wood and in acrylic, and then I tinted acrylic medium with it and applied many layers to create the variation and the depth of the color. This technique takes a long time because you have to apply several layers and let them dry in between. And then once I near the color that I want, I will start adding in some of the details and indications of wood grain and other markings using either a fan brush or, as you see in the slide in the middle, I used a very fine brush to paint individual lines and then the black decoration. On the left slide, the back of the violin was not quite as successful as I would like it to be. I tried to add in some of those darker sort of stripy lines on the back, and I used just a really watered down acrylic. And what happened was I ended up getting what I would refer to as tide lines. You can see on these markings here are these hard edges around the marks that I've made, and to try and just, make some of those areas a little bit darker. And then down here on the edge, because I used curve stock, it actually dripped down the sides and pooled a little bit on the edges, so I wasn't really happy with the way that looked. To remedy that, I have now started doing markings like that with the medium as well, just a heavier tint, and that not only reduces the tide lines, but also allows for sort of a smoother transition between the colors. And once I've done those little decorations and things, I will do another layer of just the lightly tinted medium to kind of seal into the body of the paint job or the mount, so that it looks like they're not sitting right on the surface. They're actually in the wood as they are in real life. Here is an example of that process. On the top you see layers of straight paint. Moving from left to right, you can see how the color gets darker, but it also gets more opaque. And on the bottom is the layering of tinted medium. I actually moved in the opposite direction. Thinner layers on the right. Moving towards the left, you can see as the color gets a little darker, it still stays pretty translucent. This is a later attempt at that technique for this three-necked guitar with a highly varnished sort of turtle shell surface. This slide shows the line details and the edge, and you can see that I used half oval stock for this mount, which presents a problem all its own, because painting details, especially fine lines like these, on a curved surface and trying to get them to match and line up with those on a different plane and flat surface is really hard. Not to mention that the alignment changes depending on your sight line, so this was a hard one. Stone generally can be a much more forgiving medium to replicate. Some stone, like marble, have lines and variegations, which take a little bit more effort, but often stone has variations in color and tone, and maybe some texture and speckling, all of which can be done quite easily using a sponge. Here are some examples of sponges. The brownish ones on the top are natural sponges, and you can get those at most art stores or craft stores, and I like to use them the best. They have a lot of variation in their markings, and they come in big chunks. But you could also use regular household sponges. I like to get the ones that have the scrubby side and the regular sponge side, because that gives you just one more level of markings. And I also like to cut them into little pieces, because some of the markings or the holes in them tend to be a little bit more uniform, and it's nice to be able to use all four sides of a small piece of sponge to get variation in your markings. This is a sample of a sponge painting technique. So moving from the upper left corner and then counterclockwise, I've added a total of 4 layers of different colors of paint using the sponge. So you can see how I apply each layer, and then you get a pretty solid surface at the top. This is an image of a stone schwabti, which has used some sponging for the stone pattern. And this is a lovely example of some clips for a marble base. If you don't have a sponge, another option is a heavy haired brush, or a cheap chip brush. You can cut brushes down, you can use a stencil brush, but the problem with some of these is that their markings tend to be more linear and regular, and they don't give you quite the same effect. You can also cover a lot more ground quickly with a big chunk of sponge. Sponging can be used for all kinds of materials. Here's an example of a corroded metal piece. I used a combination of sponging and brush techniques for this one. One tip I would give for mount painting is just not to be afraid to make your own tools and to play around with your materials. As I said, I cut hairs on brushes, I make markings with all kinds of tools. I try layering or laying a wrinkly plastic bag on wet paint and pull it off and see what kind of pattern it makes. It's not only fun to do this, but you can discover some really great ways and make some interesting effects through experimentation. I also have a tendency to use my fingers a lot for blending and dabbing in my paint, so I probably have fingerprints in a lot of mounts in the museum. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about details, and the level of detail you choose to paint on your mount often varies from object to object. Here are a couple of examples of types of objects that I haven't talked about yet that have some pretty detailed paint jobs. This is a Native American beaded leather bag. I went a little crazy with this one, and I painted individual beads and used sponging for the clips on the top to look like leather. Had I not had the time and the patience to do this, I would have more simply blocked out the colors and maybe added some highlights or indications of texture with a brush. This is an Islamic metal octagonal dish, and it is highly ornate with inlays and geometric decorations. But sometimes the decoration might be too complicated, or you don't have the time to fully execute it, and so then it's best not to do it. A bad paint job can be way more distracting than no paint job, so if you're limited on time, blocking out color can be the best option. This is an example of a very well matched color where the mount maker opted not to paint the details, and I think it worked really well. Here are a couple more. Again, great color match, but no detail, and it looks just fine. I found this example walking through the galleries the other day, and I find it to be kind of a happy medium. The color on this slide is bad because the object was on view, and I was taking a picture through Plexi, but you can see that there are just indications of what's going on the surface, not highly detailed, but I think it's effective enough to sort of give the feel with not going into too much detail. As I mentioned earlier, we give our mounts a final spray with a clear coat to protect them and to sort of seal them. And I would say that most often I tend to use the matte finish, and it just seems to allow the mounts to fall away a little bit better because it doesn't catch the light the way the glossy surface can. But sometimes with things like precious metals, for example, I'll use both to create more of a satin finish. The metallic paints that we use are pretty sparkly, but the surface of the metal isn't always actually glossy. So I find that a combination of the metallic paint and the satin finish create just the right appearance. You can use acrylic varnishes and mediums for top coats as well. This is particularly useful when you have those, emergency mounts or you're in a pinch, because you don't have to worry about them off-gassing. You can apply it and put them right into a case, and they're safe for the objects. It can also be good for objects that have multiple finishes, like this Islamic plate. The painted glaze surface is actually quite shiny, whereas the clay body on the edge is pretty matte. So I sprayed the entire mount using a gloss spray coat, and then I went back in with the matte medium just on the edge to tone down the glare. The last thing I want to talk about is things that I consider to be sort of speed bumps and little obstacles that make our lives as mount makers and mount painters a little bit more difficult. And the first and most obvious one probably is time. And I think most people are pretty busy, and you don't always have the luxury of time to execute things the way you want to, and you have to make your decisions based on what you have available to you for time and resources. The other one is lighting. I've had experiences where I'll make a mount and I think it's pretty nice and looks good in the shop, and then we bring it down to the gallery and it doesn't look nearly as good. And often that can be attributed to the lighting in the gallery setting, because light has varying intensity and color and warmth, and that can have an impact on how your mounts look in the gallery setting. Another one is sightline. I kind of talked about that a little bit with that guitar mount and the lines, and if you have the luxury of finding out where in a case or in an exhibition something is going to be displayed, and you can get an idea of where the viewer is going to be seeing an object, that can help you kind of get those designs and lines and things to line up and be in sync. Because sometimes if you paint something so that you're looking at it straight on, it looks really good, and you start looking at it from below, things don't line up quite as well. And the last one is curators and designers, whom we all love, but can be problematic in our lives as mount makers. For example, I had an experience where I did a really nice job on a mount and painted the details and everything, and then the curator wanted to turn it just ever so little, so that the design was like totally off. And that's what happens. Things get moved around, things get changed last minute, and we just roll with it. So thanks for listening.
So now I'm going to show you a couple of the things that I talked about in the slide presentation in real time. So here I have, when I talked about the different colors of primer and using them as an undercoat, I talked about this piece, which is a bronze, and it's quite worn, as you can see here on the leg and on the foot. So what I did here as a sample is to paint this surface black with the primer, and then I applied the bronze to the top of it. So then what I wanted to do is wear some of that away like it is on the piece itself. I've found that sandpaper isn't always the best option unless you can find a really, really fine grain of it, and I'll show you why. If I can get here, as you can see, you get these scratches instead of just wearing it away from the grit on the sandpaper. I mean, it works pretty well, but then you get these lines here, which I'm not a big fan of. So I've found that scrubbing pads work really well. They also have varying degrees of scrubbiness, so some of them are too rough as well, but this one is a Scotch brand one, but it's one that I found works pretty good. So I'll show you an example here. A little elbow grease. Rub it in a circle, and you can see how I'm starting to wear away that bronze surface. So you get something similar to what's on the piece there. The piece itself has a little bit of a bronze sheen over the black sort of tarnish, and it's not completely black. So what I would do at this point is then go back in with some of this bronze paint, kind of watered down. This is not the same exact color as the one I used here, but you get the idea. And then maybe go back into it like that to kind of tone that down a little bit. So now I'm going to show you a different thing, and this is a clip that I made for this Native American footed ceramic, and I use the sponge technique to get the paint the way I want it. And now the last thing I need to add in are these black spots that you see all over the surface, which are pretty varied in size but quite small, and there's a lot of them and they're pretty random. So rather than paint each of one of those individually, I'm going to show you two things that you can do to achieve that look. The first is to take this acid or glue brush, which has very kind of stiff and big bristles. It has sort of a roughness to it. I'm going to take that dry. I'm going to add some paint to it, get the bristles loaded up. And then I'm going to tap it out a bit because you don't want too much paint on your brush. You get really big spots. Let me show you on this piece of paper here. And now I'm just going to tap it. So you get some of those small ones. If you use a little bit wetter paint and hold it down a little bit longer, you get some larger spots. But that's one way of doing it. The other is to take kind of a longer bristled brush, and I'm going to thin out that black paint so that it's pretty fluid but still opaque. And I'm going to load up my brush, and I am going to take it and just flick. So that's two ways that you can get spots. Okay, so now we're going to go over the sponging technique, and I have employed my daughter to help because she's a really good sponger. And I'm going to use the natural sponge, which I showed you in the slides, and I'm just going to wet it. You do want to work relatively dry with this, but the sponge does need to be wet in order for it to be pliable and to pick up the paint. So I'm going to put it in the water and then really give it a good squeeze. There's not too much in it. Then I'm going to go into the blue. Ruby, you want to do that for me? You're going to pick a side that you want to use. You're going to start loading up. Yeah, and we picked blue because it's Ruby's favorite color. So we're going to start dabbing it in the paint. You really load it up there. Get it all over the surface there. And then you want to dab it like this, right? We're going to dab it all over, okay? And then we're going to tap it out, right? You don't want too much paint on there or you're just going to get big blobs. So once you've got it to a good place, you're going to go ahead and start adding it to your surface. I've already done one layer here and left the other side blank so that you could get a better idea of how it works. Let's see how you do, Rube. Good job. I'm going to do a little bit on the white so they can see how that looks. Okay, do a little bit more spread out. Good job. Okay, so with the sponging, the more you sponge, the denser it's going to be, and the more you're going to lose the colors underneath. The nice thing about sponging is you can go back into it, back and forth with different colors. If you lose too much of one color, you can go back in with it again. It's a very forgiving process. And also, if you're interested in building up some texture on the surface, you can actually use thicker paints and build up some of those little peaks and things that you can get from the sponge and the paint that's on there. So thank you, Ruby.
Yeah.
So this is, if you remember on one of the slides, I showed you a technique where I had scratched the paint. So another application for that would be if you have a ceramic that has that crackled glaze. So here I've done an example of what that might look like. The trick to this is that you have to do it when the paint is a little bit dry, but not too dry. So finding that right medium where it's still malleable, but isn't too dry that it's going to start scratching off. So over here is an example of where I waited too long, and you can see how you get these different lines and things happening, and it pulls away a lot more of the paint, which actually may be something that you're interested in. So I recently painted this. I actually just hit it with an air dryer, which is a good thing if you need to do layers in painting and you don't want to wait for them. You can always use a hair dryer or a hot air gun, which is what we have here in the shop. So this paint is just a little bit dry. And what I'm using here is actually a dental tool. If you have conservators in your facility, they love dental tools. So you can always find some with them usually, or just like a wooden skewer would work, or even a palette knife or a nail or something. So just so that you can see how that works. So now I'm going to show you a couple more tips. And the first is to use either saran wrap or a mylar as a barrier between your object and your mount when you're painting. Therefore, you protect your object. And another added benefit of using either of those is that you can go right up to your object and try your paint colors out. So you can see if you're in the right ballpark with your paints. I like to do that. And then another thing is I wanted to look at these blue leaves here, and they have that sort of watered down quality that I was talking about with the washes and the guitar mounts. So over here I have pre-painted a couple of samples. This one is a leaf done with just a watered down paint, and this leaf is done with the tinted medium. Same with here, the left is the, or what will be your right, is the watered down paint, and the left is the medium. So you can see a little bit of what I was talking about there. You get this tide line here, and then it's sort of condensed in one spot where I use the water, and the glazed one is a little bit more uniform. On the curved piece, you can see how on this one, it pooled down on one side where I use just the water, and you get a little bit more of an even coating with the medium. So I'm going to just show that in real time so you can sort of see what it does. So this is the water, just the watered down glaze. The other thing is that you can see any texture underneath from your brush strokes of your underlayer, which may not be a desired effect. And then if I do it here on this piece, you may see how it pools down on the sides. It doesn't stay where you want it. I'm also getting a little resistance, I'm not sure why, but so while we're kind of waiting for that to do its thing, I can show you one little, here you can see the tide lines coming through here, and it's sort of condensing in the middle, and you can keep trying to go back into that, but I don't find that to be as effective as using the medium. The medium is a water base, so you can thin it down a little bit if you want, but you get a nicer quality to it, and it kind of stays put. You don't get that tide line going. You can do that on the curved one as well here. And you can see that it sort of stays put a little bit better than the other one. A little bit more. The other thing is when you go back into the watered one, it tends to resolubilize. whereas the medium will kind of stay as it is. If you wanted to go in and put another coat on, that kind of stays where it is, where you run the risk of basically developing a white spot. If you go back into the wet one, it might not do things that you want it to do. So lastly on that, I'll show you one little thing you can do. Again, working with a dry brush to get some of those variegations in the leaves. You can see I use a very dry brush, and I'm going in, and this one is a little bit tougher. You might have to keep going till you get enough of a line going there. You need to use a slightly thicker brush because it's sort of collapsing in on itself. So there's that.